everyone. Emily Jashinsky, culture editor here with Libby Emmons. Libby is a senior editor at the Post Millennial and a senior contributor at the Federalist. We're going to talk today about covering the protests as journalists that have roiled the United States over the course of the summer and now into the fall election season. Libby's been following this really closely. In fact, she just did some protest coverage this weekend. There's a lot that the mainstream corporate media is not talking about when it comes to these demonstrations, many of which have become violent. Libby, tell us what you've seen, and particularly maybe this weekend.
Okay, yeah, well, I've been following a lot of this stuff. I haven't been out there that much. Andy No, who's our editor at large, has been covering Portland on the streets and getting really into that. And we've had some people in Seattle. And there's, of course, been independent journalists traveling the country covering this stuff, just driving around doing their thing. I happened to be in Washington this weekend. I was covering the WalkAway campaign on Silent Majority weekend and Women's Town Hall and March. And there turned out to be some protest activity at that event, which was pretty interesting. At one point, there were maybe 5 or 6 BLM protesters who came into the back of the crowd. We were at the Washington Memorial, and that's where the rally was set up, and they had a big stage set up. But at the back, which was closer to the memorial, that's where protesters came in, and they were pretty quickly overtaken by the Trump supporters who were in the crowd, sitting on the lawn, listening to the speeches and everything like that. And then the Parks Police just zoomed in and you could see them on the video that was captured, these blue helmets just storming in, and they rounded up the protesters who were then arrested, a couple of them, and the Trump supporters started screaming "back the blue." And that was pretty interesting to see all of that go down and be close to it, whereas most of what I've seen has been other people's coverage this summer.
What is your impression of the WalkAway crowd? Because this is basically it's I'm sure a lot of viewers are familiar with it, but it's a movement that is supposed to represent Democrats who have, quote, walked away from the party. And it's a very sort of like Trump-centric movement in that walking away from the Democratic Party because they're going towards Trump. So it's not just leaving the Democratic Party.
Right. It's a
going
walking to
Trump. Okay. So does that seem like a correct
impression?
impression?
That definitely seems correct to me. Additionally, though, there were a lot of people that I interviewed in the crowd who had either walked away more than 8 or 10 years ago, and a lot of people who their perspective was that they were walking with, that they had been conservatives and Republicans their whole lives. A lot of people that I talked to, a primary issue for them was abortion. And they were very interested in being pro-life and did not feel that the Democratic Party has any place for that anymore, whereas that used to be a thing. I mean, when I was a kid, I grew up Catholic. All the Catholics I knew were pretty much Democrats, and they were pro-life. Right. And there wasn't really a contradiction there. That was an acceptable position. I don't think that is an acceptable position for Democrats anymore. A couple of years ago, I think it was Lindy West started her pro movement. Right. And as opposed to being pro-choice, which the old feminist line for abortion was that it should be safe, legal, and rare. Right. Right.
Now it should be fun and frequent.
Now it should be birth control.
And frivolous.
Just do it. It doesn't matter. Yeah. And I think that's an opinion that strikes a lot of people the wrong way, especially from a party that is so adamantly pro-science. To say that, there's some question about when life begins seems pretty crazy. I mean, life does seem to begin at conception. And I think the pro movement was also reacting to that, saying like, okay, even if it's life, that doesn't mean we can't kill it, which if that's your position, that's your position. But I think it turned off a lot of the pro-life Democrats, or even Democrats who were in favor of the safe, legal, and rare option of choice. Worst case scenario, this is the thing that we have to do.
Well, I think the question is exactly how I'm curious, because we see, and as journalists and people who spend time on Twitter, we see movements like WalkAway and tweets that are promoting the WalkAway movement get thousands of retweets. And you can see the same with some movements on the left. I mean, some of the insane stuff that leftists will say, I'm like, who are the 30,000 people that have liked this insanity?
Yeah.
And so it's really tough to know sometimes how much, viral content online is representing a broader movement in the public. And with WalkAway, I'm really curious to know how many, or like if Donald Trump has really tapped into something that's motivated, a wider swath of voters than we might see from a demonstration on the mall that you attended, which looked like it had a few hundred people. And that's no easy feat.
I think it was like 500-ish maybe, could be more. I didn't get an official count, but I think you're correct. I think it does have a lot to do with Trump, and a lot of the people that I spoke to did not want to go on the record. They didn't want to talk about, they didn't want to be on camera. They didn't want their names to be used. There were a fair number of people who said that they feared retribution in their towns where they lived, their little small towns or whatever, for being pro-Trump, and that they were not, in fact, vocal about it at home or even among their families. And some of these were older women, 50s, 60s, whose kids are very liberal and who their kids didn't want them there. And they were there anyway. So there were a fair number of people like that. I also encountered the founder of the movement is Brandon Strauch, and he's a gay man. And there were a lot of gay men at the event, some of whom I talked to. And for them, a lot of this had to do with abortion and not feeling like they had to be beholden to the liberal idea on abortion just because they were gay, that these two things didn't have anything in common to them. One man said, when he questioned his friends and colleagues about why he should be supporting abortion, they said, well, we all have the same enemies. And he was like, maybe we don't, I don't think I need to be involved in that. So that was, But I do think Trump and his, he's such a massive cultural figure.
Right.
And I think that has a lot to do with this because he's so big.
Yeah. Well,
he's got his own gravitational pull.
That's a great way to put it. And what's interesting to me about this is it seems as though a lot of the people who would, give up their Saturday and go to a WalkAway movement event on the National Mall, it seems like they're latching onto these kind of contradictions on the left, whether it's about abortion or feminism. And a lot of it has to do, honestly, with political correctness and the narrowing of the boundaries of acceptable speech. So, for instance,
that's in there too.
If this was a Democratic Party that was tolerant of pro-life Democrats, if this were a Democratic Party that was tolerant of people who were concerned about, giving hormones to young children who are diagnosed with gender dysphoria,
right.
If this were a more tolerant Democratic Party, perhaps this pitch from Trump and from pro-Trump supporters would be sort of dead on arrival.
Right. Part of it too is that the liberal Democrats are kind of gone. The Democratic Party that I grew up with was, very I despise your views, but I respect to the death your right to have them. It's very First Amendment oriented. That seems to be gone on the left because
look at the ACLU.
The ACLU, the AP has now redefined riot for us so that we don't have to, believe that it's a bad thing. Looting is reparations. All of this language policing and this strange penchant for forcing people to either espouse your views or lose their community. And that's another thing I think I saw with WalkAway is that it is creating a community. And so what people are walking to is not just a political idea, but a community where they can exist and have friends. And there was a whole, I think it was called Rescue America. They were doing rallies all over the country. And I was also at one in Milwaukee.
Oh,
yeah.
My neck of the woods.
Yeah, it was cool out there. I liked Milwaukee.
Yeah, I just got back.
Yeah, oh, nice. But I think that's part of it too, is the establishment of a community after feeling locked out of the one that you were involved in.
Yeah, I think we're actually seeing a lot of that on the streets this summer. And the reason that a lot of these people are so passionate about, on the left and the right, is that it's exactly what, Tim Carney wrote about in Alienated America, that what is drawing people to populism is the cratering of some of these fundamental community institutions in their towns. Now, what's what's interesting about all this, I mean, there's so much interesting about all of this, is that the political class, I don't think, understands the way that political correctness is shaking up the parties, and is like, again, like, I don't know how widespread WalkAway is, but I do know there are a lot of people who voted for Obama and voted for Trump, and when they were doing it, they weren't like, NATO, trade deals, like, right. It's not a policy vote in so many cases. Vote. It's a feeling vote.
Yeah, and it's a very emotional thing, and a
right.
lot of the people were very emotional. Yeah, and to get back to the thing about the independent journalist coverage yes. too, there was so after the sort of initial melee that the Parks Police quelled to the delight of the Trump supporting crowd, because they loved it. There was just one lone BLM protester yeah. standing off to the side, white woman, young 20s, I think, wearing black, and she had a face mask on. She had a little cardboard sign that was just like a Amazon box or whatever that said Black Lives Matter on it. And she was just standing there very silent protesty. And I noticed her. And then I noticed other people with cell phones and cameras noticing her.
Right.
A man with a Trump sign went over, and she had this little cardboard sign. He had this giant sign on a stick that was red, white, and blue, and said a whole bunch of, I don't know, whatever pro-Trump stuff. And he goes over to talk to her. He stood pretty close to her. The speeches are loud. It's hard to talk to people. It's hard right. to hear things. So he's standing close to her, and they have this conversation. As soon as he gets over to her and starts talking, I got up and walked over, as well as a bunch of other independent journalists stood up and just started crowding around. And I have this wild photograph of just the two of them standing there talking, just people having a conversation, and like 10 journalists trying to get the best angle, just flanking them off to the side. And I thought, they'll cover this, they'll get close to this, and it'll look like a whole big thing.
Yeah.
It's just two people talking. And the more journalists showed up to try and get involved in that and, get the footage of it, a WalkAway security person came over and stood between the two of them and was saying, back up, don't bother her to the Trump guy, to like protect this young woman.
Right.
Which is sort of a natural impulse, I think, of security guys to protect a young woman from a guy with a giant sign. So he's telling the man to back up, and the man's just like, we were just having conversation.
Yeah.
We're just having conversation. We were having a good conversation, but security got in the way. The journalists were looking for any kind of conflict because that's what they want to see. The security guys didn't want the conflict. Some other bikers for Trump were saying, they're just trying to distract you from the speeches, listen to the speeches, whatever. And these two people probably could have worked something out.
Yeah.
They probably could have found a number of points where they agree, but everybody has to get in the way of these two sides having a reasonable conversation.
And you were sort of covering the coverage, which
I was covering the coverage at that point.
I mean, it's important because, people cover the coverage on, after someone says something on cable news or the New York Times says something dumb, but like in real time, covering the coverage is important because some of the stuff just sort of gets beamed onto Twitter or social media. And the journalists who are doing the beaming are more interested in the retweets and the likes and the views than they are about saying, this is the context. These were two people who were having a conversation. This wasn't a massive argument. Right. We were surrounded by journalists. The cameras, I imagine you noticed that the cameras probably changed the conversation.
Yeah, it's the Heisenberg uncertainty principle of, covering things.
I call that the Kardashian principle.
Oh,
Libby.
How about that? You can't know what's happening and record it at the same time.
Right.
It's like, Heisenberg, you can't know how fast something is going and where it is at the same time. And I think
if a Kardashian falls in the woods, does it make a sound?
I have no idea because there wasn't anyone there to cover it. No one's going to tell me. But it is kind of fascinating because we've been seeing this all summer. And, since even Floyd's death was caught by an independent cell phone camera.
Yes. Yep.
And we've been seeing it all summer. And the more the mainstream media has not covered this stuff and has pushed away from covering it or has minimized it, the more the independent journalists have risen up.
Yeah.
And a lot of the independent journalists are independent because they're going into these areas. What outlet wants to provide liability insurance for that?
Yeah.
For like people getting hurt.
Which is amazing because, as you said, the AP has clearly informed us that riots
they're not even real.
They're not real.
It's kind of a fiction.
Right.
So we've been seeing this happen, and it's such a fascinating juxtaposition. You had, I believe it was in Kenosha, Omar Jimenez was reporting for CNN, and the chyron beneath him actually said fiery but mostly peaceful protest.
That's amazing.
As he's standing in front of a building that is like so torched and it's on fire. There's no sirens. There's no firemen. There's nothing, but it's fiery but mostly peaceful. And then you have people like, Elijah Schaffer and Shelby Talcott going into these places and like getting up close and personal and actually getting the footage and getting a much clearer understanding of what's going on from the ground. But then when you see it up close and it's two people talking, it's so hard to discern what the real story is.
I have a memory of being outside the White House in, I think, late June. And I hadn't done coverage like this before. So I was way up at the front, kind of in the fray where the protesters were heckling the police officers, and it was getting, there's chemical irritants being used and it sounded like flashbangs and all that stuff. And I noticed that I was literally the only journalist up there. And of course, it's like, we're not, the New York Times or the Washington Post. We're a relatively new outlet, and I'm relatively young. And there was it was like all the other reporters were in the back, right? Like they were in the back talking to the people who had just shown up on their bikes and were, getting their pictures and everything. They were not talking to the people in the front. And they, you can see how that would distort their coverage if they're talking to the people who showed up with their coffees on their bikes. And I just remember thinking like, why am I up here and you're back there?
What are you guys doing?
Right. Like I didn't even think about it. I was like, I'm here to cover what's happening. And there's some crazy stuff going on right there. What are you doing?
I think there's also, we were talking about this the other day. There's also this thing where like, you either have the instinct to rush in and get it or you don't. And I think, some of these people who have been out there this summer, their instinct is to just run toward danger. Yeah. They're just going to dash in. Yeah.
Shelby and Richie were on our podcast last week talking about that. Talking about amazing. How they're like athletes and
yeah. Oh, that's right. Because she was like a pro something. Pro tennis, right? Yeah, pro tennis. That's so cool. Yeah. So, I mean, that's an instinct. You can't really teach somebody to dash into the fray and cover stuff. Yesterday, I'm sitting there in the sunshine, the beautiful day.
National,
idyllic. There were 5 protesters, and I was like, "Oh, I'll run over and cover 5 protesters."
Right.
I don't think I would be rushing toward the burning buildings in Kenosha to.
Oh, I think you would.
Really? You think so? Maybe if I had the right helmet.
Yeah, that's what it comes down to. But the broader point again is that there's like this weird situation where, as a viewer, as a news consumer, as a journalist, you have to be really careful with some of the coverage that's coming out here because some of it lacks context. Some of it is in the context of these people with cameras on them who know that there's this sort of like viral economy, and then some of it is like legitimately really interesting stuff. Right. But the point is we can't trust the media to not just be like fomenting insanity because nobody trusts that their coverage has the proper context.
Now, of course, this isn't new.
Right.
Journalists have always been trying to sell newspapers.
Yeah.
I mean, if it bleeds, it leads is not a new thing to say.
Right.
This is a very old concept.
Right.
So I wonder if perhaps we got to a point where people in the public were more trusting of media and then have to relearn this lesson.
That's a good question. I actually, to sort of tie everything together, I don't think people, again, in the political class truly understand what level of distrust in the media, and not just distrust in the media, but like contempt for the media, the way the media treats people. I don't think the media understands the extent to which that creates things like the WalkAway movement and then creates things like Donald Trump's presidency, because as you said, it's a feeling. When people cast a ballot for Donald Trump, when a lot of people, I shouldn't generalize and say it's everybody, but when a lot of people cast a ballot for Donald Trump, it's not about policy and it's not about partisanship, because there are a lot of people who went Obama Trump in those key swing states. If you want to reach those voters, you have to reform the media and you have to reform the Democratic Party. If anything, they're going in the opposite direction.
Right. Well, the Democratic Party at this point is so weird.
Yeah.
You know, they've got this whole crazy ideology thing about, and we have, you know, plague going on as well, which has made so many changes. But the thing that killed me with the Democratic Party this year, and that I don't think I could ever rectify this. So when the lockdown started in New York, it was March 16th, the schools closed. And I started saying, like, you know, there's going to be riots. This is going to be a serious problem. And people were like, nah, that's crazy. And I was like, no, we're going to have suicide. We're going to have riots. And I always just think the worst possible thing is going to happen. I mean,
great year for you.
My mindset anyway, it always has been. But yeah, when that all started, and then it was April, and 2 weeks to flatten the curve had turned into indefinite period of time to flatten the curve. And we started seeing the anti-lockdown protesters, most notably, I think, in Michigan, and all, you know, they had much better PR, but also in North Carolina, with these two women got involved trying to like open up their state. And it was fascinating to watch this. And I remember looking at this, and they were over at the State House in Lansing, I think it was, against Whitmer's orders to lock, you know, her coronavirus inspired restrictions, as I now think of them, inspired by coronavirus. And there they were with their guns and everything, and the media freaked out. You guys are selfish. This is stupid. You're so privileged. It's, you know,
toothless rubes.
This whole thing, you know,
Duck Dynasty viewers.
You just want to go have brunch and get your nails done. How could you be so stupid? This whole thing. And I remember thinking, like, okay, sure, but this is political speech, and they have a right to free assembly, as we do. We have a right to free speech. We have a right to all of these things. We have a right to our freedom of religion. They want their churches open. These are our rights. I get it. You know, by all means, do your protest. Mainstream media, you know, you're terrible. Then it's the end of May. And at the end of May, we had all of these protests beginning because George Floyd was, you know, killed or died or whatever that turns out to have been. Which is now, of course, dodgy. Because there's like all of these other sort of reports. Yeah, that's a whole crazy thing. Anyway.
Another Pandora's box we could open. Or...
I'm not even going to talk about this.
Leave that shut.
Anyway, so after that happened, we had massive protests. Not just, you know, 100 people in Lansing saying, open up my state. We had thousands and thousands and thousands of people in Brooklyn. At one point, there were, I think, 10,000 people in front of the Brooklyn Museum protesting for Black trans lives. And now the media account was drastically different. Instead of you are, you know, selfish and bad for protesting, now you are admirable because racism is a public health crisis, which somehow supersedes the public health crisis of the plague. Right. So now it's a totally different thing. And that juxtaposition of protesters for one thing, bad and selfish, protest for something else, courageous and heroic, is it's just completely unforgivable, unfathomable.
It's totally disqualifying.
This narrative shift is total and complete trash. And the Democratic Party supported it.
And the Democratic Party echoed it.
They echoed it. So free speech for some things, bad. Free speech for other things, good. And that's just not how our rights work.
Well, it's like free speech for some, this is where like this example is particularly glaring. It's like free speech for one thing is medically dangerous and free speech for another thing is medically necessary. Like,
and then in New York, you had Bill de Blasio and I think Andrew Cuomo saying to contact tracers, don't ask people if they've been at protests because that's not fair. So now we can't track whether or not people got sick from the protest because you're not allowed to ask them. And this same media enterprise is saying that Trump rallies are super spreader events. Well, if one massive political speech event is a super spreader event, aren't all massive political events, super spreader events. The two things can't both, there's no, it's like an ideological divide is telling us whether or not you're going to get sick. And now we have the whole media also blaming Republicans for getting coronavirus.
Yeah.
Meanwhile, we have had decades of medical professionals telling us that if you contract an illness, it's not your fault. Right? If you get HIV, it's not your fault. I'm on board with that. I'm not going to blame you for getting sick no matter what. Like, oh no, you know, it's like telling people you drank from a muddy stream and you got cholera. That's your fault. But that's the only water. You know, I don't know. Yeah. So this whole thing now of like blaming conservatives for getting sick because somehow they did something wrong. It's a willful and in some cases just like blindly partisan misreading of the Republican logic, which was that we have to accept some risk to go on with our life as normal and to rescue jobs and businesses. Now you can disagree with that logic, but misrepresenting that logic is like as nobody will get sick if we reopen and like forego masks in situations. That's absolutely not anybody's argument. Right. And what they're saying is like they're basically just saying Republicans were like, yeah, everything will be fine if we like just open it all up. Yeah, just like life is back to normal. Everyone will be fine.
Had Biden saying that the job of the presidency is to protect the American people. And that's not the job of the presidency at all. You know, defend our rights. These are our rights. You don't get to squash them.
Right.
But I don't want my government out there trying to keep me safe because my guess is we have completely different definitions of what that means.
Yeah.
And I would always rather have the freedom to do as I choose than the requirement to do what the government tells me for my own good.
Right. If you have to pick one or the other.
I mean, go to hell.
Yeah. Which is what you would think that, and we can, like, if people don't know Libby's background, it's extremely interesting, and it's why she's a great person to cover movements like WalkAway. But, like, if people don't know your background, like, you come from the art world, and you'd think that people on the left would be the ones that are telling the government to go to hell.
That's what we used to do.
Like,
we
please
used to be
chain
doing that.
us up. We need your protection. We are in desperate need of your embrace, your warm embrace. Right.
I don't want any piece of this.
Right.
I want the government to be as removed from my life as possible,
and
while still providing what, you know, we have voted to tell them what to do.
Did that previously inform your sort of like liberalness?
Yes.
Right.
These were core values of my liberalness were, you know, protection of First Amendment rights, government staying out of my business, government staying out of my body. Has anyone heard this phrase before? Apparently that only matters when you're trying to kill babies.
Right. So now this is a good way to like kind of get into what moved you from, I don't know if like the definitions, you haven't changed. The definitions have changed. Is that accurate? Right. Yeah. And so how do you define yourself now? Do you like think of yourself as a conservative or are you still like a liberal at heart?
I don't even know what these words mean.
Yeah.
And I think that the parties have completely shifted. That was another thing when I was talking to people at WalkAway, and a lot of them were telling me that they feel that the Republican Party is now the party of the working class. That's brand new.
Yeah.
That used to definitely be the Democratic Party with the labor unions and all of that. And now the way that the Democratic Party is operating with labor unions is also completely anathema to liberalism.
Yeah.
It's being like, it's more like labor unions are not there to elevate workers and give workers a voice. They're there to be enforced upon people. Look at this stupid PRO Act in the Senate that was based on California's AB 5 that I wrote about for the Federalist a million times because it's so infuriating that the Democrats want to take my work away from me and make it so I can't do my job. Of course, now I work in Canada, so, you know, I can tell them exactly what to do with their stupid act.
Until you get audited.
Until I get audited and cut that out. But yeah, these were core values for me, and they still are. And I don't think that they are core values of the leftist movement at this point.
Well, and this is what I can't imagine, and we were talking a little about this a little bit off camera, is that the frustration that must exist inside of you as somebody who has been, you know, working with trans artists, working to include different, voices racially in your own art and in the art scene in general, you are now regularly sort of assaulted with all of the derogatory isms, the racism. It's Twitter assault. Right, yeah. right. And that's, something that caused your career shift also.
Yeah,
and so
now I'm called racist frequently, which is kind of crazy to me. And I think everything in my background shows that that's actually trash. But you can't say that you're not racist, because if you say that you're not racist, that's evidence that you are racist.
Yes. Because there's no such thing as being not racist. Yeah. According to the best-selling author of the summer, Ibram X. Kendi, you're only anti-racist.
Right.
We're racist.
So I kind of just ignore that, because I think it's just such obvious trash.
But it has to be so frustrating, because you're somebody who actually was standing up against all this. I mean, you were involved in these leftist protests for years.
No, I was. I marched to free Mumia Abu-Jamal and for gay rights and for gay marriage.
And against Iraq.
And I marched in 2003 against the Iraq War.
Right.
I marched with the transit union and shut down the 59th Street Bridge.
Regular Susan Sarandon over here.
It was great. Jerry Springer was there. I have photos of Jerry Springer at that march.
Jerry. That's great.
Yeah, well, something to do. But
as opposed to watching Jerry Springer.
Right, which is
what the rest of the country was doing while you were standing up for social justice.
Right, but I wasn't standing up for social justice. I was, a pacifist. It's interesting to me too, because for people talk about single issue voters.
Yeah.
And so when I turned 18, I thought what it would be my single issue, and it would pretty much be anti-war.
Mm-hmm.
And now we're watching Donald Trump as the anti-war candidate.
Yeah.
He's pulling troops out. He's doing all this stuff. And I called my mom, who's very liberal, and she was like, I don't even want to talk about this, honey. We're just not even going to talk about it. And I was like, okay, how's the dog? Are you still cooking him chicken? What's going on? And she is. She's cooking chicken.
It's a lucky dog.
A lucky dog. Sweet little thing.
Yeah.
Yeah. So I don't know. Every time I take, how there's all those Cosmo quizzes online of what political party are you?
Teen Vogue.
Yeah, not even Cosmo, but whatever they are.
Yeah.
I'll take those periodically, and I'll be like, I wonder where I land on the spectrum.
What do you get?
I'm center left.
Yeah, that sounds right.
I'm purple.
But they don't want you. So there's no room for you, which is how you end up affiliating with trash like me.
I love you, Emily.
Likewise. But no, it's just to me, you're a great case study in how the sort of Kendis of the world, their philosophy falls apart when applied to reality, which is that there's no way somebody can look at your background and say you weren't, promoting racial equality.
Right.
But to say that to imply based on this expanded and ridiculous definition of the word racism that you're complicit or worse, it's just insane. It doesn't hold up to basic scrutiny. It's something that sounds really good in an ivory tower conversation that's fueled by espresso. But then when you have to actually say here's what's happening with a real person, just shove it. This is wrong.
Yeah. There was a thing too, I think I was telling you about this. I had a theater company in New York. We were just this little indie theater company. Mm-hmm. We were in residence at a place called Bowery Poetry Club, which, this was some of the most fun I ever had, was doing shows at this little poetry club downtown. Mm-hmm. It was great. And at a certain point, I think it was maybe 2000, we launched in 2004, sort of officially, doing shows at bars. It's environmental theater. Mm-hmm. It's a party atmosphere. And so we were doing these shows. And at a certain point, I kind of looked around and I was like, oh, we're working with all white artists. Mm-hmm. Why were we working with all white artists? These were the people in our social group. These were the people in the shows that we had done. I would work on a show. I would reach out to the actors in the show. I'd say, hey, I'm producing a show. Do you want to come work on this? And then when we realized it, we were like, oh, well, let's go find other artists, Yeah. So we started going to shows that had Black actors in them, shows produced by Black theater companies. We started just checking out other stuff and then operating exactly the same way. Go for drinks with people. Hey, you were awesome in the show.
Right.
Would you want to come work on our show? And it wasn't an affirmative action thing. It was let's just look around more.
Let's be better.
Let's just let's expand our network. Mm-hmm. So at a certain point, we had a pretty diverse show, I think. And it wasn't
it wasn't about that. It was just working with the best artists that we could find. And we just kept looking, you know? And so when we see all of this stuff about grants to promote diversity and to encourage voices and all of this stuff, I mean, sure, but you don't need all that to do it. All you really need to do is to like go do a little looking around, expand your social group, make new friends. It's not hard. And that's what we were doing, which was great. You know, we had like, we had Black artists and South Asian artists and, you know, East Asian artists working on our show because these were the best artists that there were. And
now these folks won't affiliate with you, I imagine, at all.
Yeah, they won't really affiliate with me. Some people...
because what? You have like some heterodox views on hormone therapy for children.
Hormone therapy for children. Yeah. And, you know, I mean, I've written some stuff that could be perceived as pro-Trump. Sure. I mean, he's the anti-war candidate. Yeah. And I'm anti-war.
And you're a liberal artist. Imagine.
I'm opposed to war.
Yeah.
Shocking. You know. And I was interested also in the critical race theory stuff. I don't know that I'm crazy about the federal government dictating local educational policy. I wasn't in favor of it with No Child Left Behind. I definitely wasn't in favor of it with Common Core. Yeah. And I'm not in favor of that at any point, but I do appreciate the recognition of this indoctrination. Right. And it's, I think what it mostly does is give parents and perhaps educators who are not in favor of this the realization that they can use their voice on their local level, even if nothing happens with regard to federal legislation or, you know, money or any of that. I think what it does really is let people know that they can speak up.
Was Trump the sort of like motivating factor? If you look at your own life, was it the Trump moment, not Trump himself, but sort of the like cultural earthquake? Because there were tremors before, but was it the cultural earthquake that is Donald Trump that finally sort of cast you to the career shift into opening up more and speaking more honestly about what you believe? Or was that something that predated Trump?
Predated.
Okay.
Yeah, it was, I think, in 2015 that the situation with gender ideology became so clear.
The Dear Colleague letter that the Department of Education issued.
But it was much more personal for me. The idea was in Indie Theater in downtown New York, which is where I spent all of my time, and I rarely ever peeked up. Yeah. You know, I didn't really know what was going on politically, and I didn't care. Right. I knew what was happening at my local theaters. Right. So, and that's all I cared about. But when it turned out that I was supposed to refer to myself as cis, I was like, wait, what? Why do I have to change just because you want to do your thing? Yep. Like, you do your thing, I'll do my thing. I don't have to change to accommodate your thing.
It's groupthink.
Yeah.
Which
and there's no
should be
reason
anathema
for me to be different just because you want to be different. Like, you're great. I'm, fine. Unlike Emily's my...
Yeah, it's fine. It'll be fine.
But like, I don't need... Yeah. And then the other piece of gender ideology that I found frustrating was the sudden inability to define the word woman. Mm-hmm. And the word woman started to be defined by appearance and feeling. Yep. And as someone who grew up raised by two strong women, my stepmom and my mom, as well as my dad, who wasn't a strong woman. I mean, maybe. But the idea that being a woman somehow had to do with how you look and what you like to play with and the kind of activities you engage in was everything I had been told was not true. Yeah. By Democrats, by the left, by liberals. So that really got under my skin because I felt that transgender ideology was actually promoting sex stereotypes, right, in a way that was anathema to my experience, the experience of my sisters and my friends,
and harmful,
right. Because then what it does is it says like to a young girl, and there's been such a huge increase in young women transitioning and getting their breasts chopped off.
Yep.
Which just, how could something that advocates for the mutilation of a healthy body be
A healthy female body.
Yeah, be like be positive? How is this a positive movement that you have to, the very notion that you have to dismember yourself in order to be who you truly are is a garbage idea. And it's anathema to feminism. It's anathema to liberalism. And it's anathema to everything that the identity movement was previously about.
Yeah, it erases actually the victories.
It erases it. Yeah. And it's not something that you would tell anybody else.
Right.
There was, for a little bit, there was talk about how there were people who believed they should have been born amputees. But doctors were not going to cut off somebody's leg so that they would feel better about themselves. They said that that was not an okay thing. But so long as it's your breasts, you can get those cut off.
Did you watch Saturday Night Live this weekend? That might sound like a rapid conversation change, but did you?
Because I was drinking vodka this weekend.
Oh, well, that's a really good excuse
really
not to watch SNL
on Saturday.
I was going to say, I mean, the devolution of SNL is a great example of how, like, people who used to, comedians of all people, this group that used to have the sharpest edges politically, left, right, whoever it is, you're going to get roasted by it. And you're going to deserve it, and it's going to help us think about things in a different way. But it's essentially become and this episode totally proved it, the way that Biden was played by Jim Carrey, which was just Jim Carrey playing Jim Carrey because Jim Carrey is obsessed with Jim Carrey. It's just like, where is what are they doing? Why can't they, like, Joe Biden, please roast him. Like, he says funny, crazy, insane things, like dog-faced pony soldier.
What is he even
He's a
about
gift
ever?
to you. He is a gift to you. And, like, Trump is really hard to satirize because he's so self-aware. But, like, come on, Joe Biden, like, do a good job here.
Yeah.
It's a gift.
Yeah, the only way to satirize Trump is to have him say that he's great even more.
Yeah.
Which then he just goes and does. So it's kind of just the same. It's like
he knows what he's doing too. He totally knows what he's doing. I don't know.
Yeah. I didn't watch that. I have been thinking though that I wanted to see Jim Carrey. I was wondering what he would do with it. He doesn't do anything with it, apparently.
He plays Biden as Jim Carrey, and, like, eccentric and smiley. But it's just like, Woody Harrelson is much better. He's a much better Biden. But either way, like, they spin their wheels over Trump, and there's just, like, literally no balance. And I think they would tell you that's deliberate because they don't want to do anything that would possibly help Trump get reelected. Like, this is a group of people that was presumably upset when Jimmy Fallon ruffled Donald Trump's hair because it was humanizing, and it's just, like, mind-numbingly stupid.
Yeah, and I still don't really understand how we ended up with Biden and Harris.
Right.
Harris pulled so low when there were, I think maybe 600 or 700 Democratic candidates running for president.
Right.
And she pulled, like, super low among all of them. And now she's got the VP nod, which is crazy. And Biden, everybody said while during all of the Democratic Party debates, nobody wanted him.
No.
And now we have the two people that nobody wanted.
Yeah.
How do you come up with this as your big plan?
It's the Democratic establishment.
It's a stupid plan.
Right. Well, the establishment flipped out.
Maybe it's going to work. Who knows? But it's still stupid because they're not going to be good leaders.
Well, and it's also, it angers people that want to vote for the party, and it sets them back in terms of appealing to younger people. And, like, if they're worried about young people turning out to vote, what they did is not going to be helpful.
Right. Putting the pro-cop candidate in.
Yeah.
And the guy who cannot seem to form a clear thought.
Which, again, it's like great fodder for SNL, but because they're so terrified that somebody's going to turn around and say, thanks to you, we have 4 more years of Donald Trump. It's like, it's interesting to me that you said, like, you didn't used to think about politics that much. And, like, artists should think about politics, obviously, but, like, being obsessed with the sort of partisan fray, just be obsessed with creating really funny content. Like,
but there's a new thing. And this emerged in the arts community a few years ago, or maybe further back. Who knows? Time has no meaning anymore in the era of plague. But this idea came about of artist activism.
Yep.
And the idea was that your work needed to be political and make a political statement.
And that's the key distinction.
Required.
Right.
Must be. It's a huge, this is our great responsibility as artists. We need to advocate for the political right thing to do.
Yeah.
And so a lot of plays that I saw from my colleagues started to be much more about being politically activist, which borders on propaganda, because it's not a critically thought out idea. It's not driven by character. It's not driven by, the character's needs and wants and whatever else. It's about reflecting an ideology in order to attain a certain goal. And that's propaganda.
And it's not entertaining.
It's not entertaining, but these are, and we have a situation now where to be a playwright, to be an artist, all that stuff, you're supposed to go to grad school, which is like thousands and thousands and thousands of dollars. I know, because I did that, and it was expensive. But people go to grad school, they emerge with the same voice as everyone else who went to grad school. I was telling you, like, when I see a show, a TV show, I can recognize when it's a writer who went to Columbia because I had that same, like, I know it's the same.
Right.
I'm like, oh, that's a Columbia writer. I can tell right away. Yep. And it's just obvious. I'm sure it's obvious to all of my classmates as well. But you aren't going to get work if you satirize Biden in a way that leads to, people thinking something bad about him.
It's amazing.
So it's a lot of groupthink, and it's enforcement through opportunities. You're not going to get the opportunity.
Right.
And it's disappointing, because I think what it does is it takes really talented writers and it tells them to squash their talent and just work in service to this one thing.
It conditions them to
do it.
Starting in school to the point where, like, you're incapable of free thought because you think free thought is some sort of, like, conspiracy to propagate racism.
And there's so many talented writers. The universities are actually full of really talented writers.
Well, and that's why it's hard to even realize what we've lost culturally, is because some of this starts with, like, this sounds crazy, but it is literally conditioning that starts at a young age. And then by the time they're actually working artists, it's over. The battle's already won.
They're already doing it.
Yeah.
They're already complete propagandists.